I am Dr. Craig Chalquist. This is the third video of the series on Terrapsychological inquiry, and I wanted to talk today about whole person research in the kind of work that we do. So I thought I'd start with a definition and then just give you a couple of examples of how this looks. So for a definition by whole person research, I don't mean using your hatred, although I suppose the energy in it might be useful. I don't mean being consumed by an ideology such that all you do is for the cause and you stop being a human being anymore. I don't mean, somebody once said, using Jungian language, shouldn't we become our shadow, our dark side, and become a Sith Lord, you mean, or a psychopath? No, I don't mean that. So let's be a little bit more nuanced. By whole person research, what we mean is drawing consciously on as much of yourself as you can access. Drawing consciously on as much of yourself as you can access. Carl Rogers used to point out in connection with his research that the more access you have to different parts of your experience, the more accurate your perceptions tend to be. This is something that for some reason the natural science model and the way it's practiced hasn't seemed to pick up. They're so busy focusing on instrumentation, objectivity, cleansing the self of emotion, which simply drives it underground, that there isn't a lot of talk that I've heard anyway on how the more in touch you are with your unconscious feelings and drives and past experience, the more in touch you are with your body, your moods, your sensory impressions, as much experience as you can contact. The more you do that, the more your perceptions will tend to be accurate and the less distorted they'll be. Although there's always the possibility for some distortion. So let me give you a few examples of what I mean by whole person research. These all come from research that's been done by me and my students using terrapsychological inquiry over the years. And if you don't know what that is, I'm going to refer you back to the very first video where I cover it pretty fully. So examples of whole person research. One of them I touched on in the previous video, which was on how terrapsychological inquiry uses research methods from the humanities in the tradition of qualitative research. And that would be emotional involvement. Emotional involvement in the research means bringing your feelings into, not trying to be a brain only looking over things, and especially the left hemisphere of the brain, just being analytical, just being cognitive, but more about accessing all your feelings, past feelings, present feelings, anticipations, the whole range of your emotionality. And when you do that consciously, then you can manage it. Then you're aware of what gets brought up. And this is a direct aid to accuracy and perception because probably the leading cause of distorted perceptions in research is emotions that are left in the unconscious. So the more you do your work on yourself in terms of accessing your emotionality, the better. So full emotional involvement. The other part of this is when you're really lit up by a topic and enthusiastic about it, it energizes everything that you do in a way that simply working with it mentally isn't going to do for you. So full emotional involvement. Next, using your intuition in the research. So I have an example of that. Oftentimes when people interview in qualitative research situations, you'll sense that there's something underneath what somebody is saying, or that there's a question that you need to ask that'll maybe take it in a somewhat different direction. Could be a question you haven't asked any of the other people participating in the interview, but you just have this feeling, this sense, this intuition that it can take the whole interview in a fruitful direction. And it could just be some little thing like, can you say a little bit more about this? Or I'm sensing a tone of that emotion underneath what you're saying. Is that accurate or am I totally wrong? And just asking clarifying questions, or just actually coming up with a whole new question that just pops into your head from your unconscious and saying, you know, and being open about it, saying, I don't even have this on my list of things to ask you, but this question keeps coming at me, so I'm just going to put it out there and see what happens. And then you ask, and 9 times out of 10, it's the right question. So trusting your intuition. And one other example is when you're looking over the data, and we use the word data in a very broad sense. We mean basically everything that the study collects. Interview transcripts and recordings and documentation and all kinds of things, texts. So oftentimes we look for themes in the material, depending directly on what the research question is. And so your intuition will tell you this theme keeps coming up, or this image keeps coming up in people's experience. I wonder what that is. So that's another way to use intuition. So embodiment is a third aspect of whole person research, embodying the research. So for instance, tracking your moods, tracking how your body feels in different research situations. I found in trying out what I was calling in my dissertation a psychoanalysis of place that oftentimes how my body felt in different locations gave me vital information about what was going on there ecologically. So that would be an example. And also moving around and doing things, not just sitting behind a desk, but getting out and talking to people and moving your body around. Sometimes, too, movement itself can be incorporated into what you're doing, whether at the end when you're I was going to say defending your dissertation, but this can be used outside of academia, too. So maybe you're doing a report, or maybe you're waking your community up to an issue that needs dealing with. So movement can be part of that performance. And, there's this whole rich literature, somatic psychology, and I want to refer to Ray Johnson's books, and there's many others. So getting your body involved in the work. Also a self-care aspect to this. If you're sleepless all the time, if you're not getting enough rest, you're not going to be a very good researcher. So tending to your own needs, knowing when to take a break, knowing when your body has had enough, that's part of this too. So on a psychological note, consulting the unconscious, however you conceptualize it. Sometimes I use William James's phrase instead. He didn't like the term unconscious because it sounded like this thing, like an attic or something, or a basement, and which is why, incidentally, a lot of us don't say subconscious because it implies that it's lower than the rest of consciousness, and we think it's all around the ego, all around consciousness, ego being the sense of I or me. And so he called it the transmarginal, which is kind of neat. Out past the edges of your awareness. And so two ways to consult the unconscious, which Carl Rogers referred to as your total organismic experiencing. I guess he didn't like the term unconscious either. So one is to do active imagination, which is a Jungian technique from Carl Jung's side of the fence. And when you do this, you might hold your research topic in your imagination and then let yourself get into kind of a daydreamy state, a state of reverie. And then ask the topic to show you what it needs in order to open up. Now, from a strictly rationalistic point of view, this sounds like nonsense. A topic is just a thing. It's just a concept. It's just an area that you're investigating. But the psyche has this marvelous ability to personify parts of itself, as Jung pointed out. So it can take just about anything, any aspect of your experience, including your field of study, and turn it into an animal, an entity, a personality. And we see this all the time in dreams. So go with that and let your unconscious do that, and call up a topic or call up some fantasy about the kinds of beings or animals or what have you that support your work, and see who walks in and see what kind of conversations you can have. Many times you can learn from doing this things that you couldn't learn otherwise. So, and another way of doing it is dreams. I think I'm going to have to do an entire video on working with dreams in research. But your dreams can give you invaluable information about the research process. And when I teach Terrapsychological inquiry, I always emphasize to my students, watch not only your dreams, but the dreams of people that are close to you, because sometimes what's going on for you will show up with them too. Psychoanalysts know this. They call it the different things, the interactive field for one, or the transferential field. We're all connected with each other, so It's very common, actually, for one person's dreams to show up in somebody else. Happens all the time. I see this in class a lot too, by the way. Often there's one person who's kind of the class dreamer, and it could be that the other people don't really remember their dreams very well, but this person does, and so we take it as a group dream. So lots of interesting work to be done there. Dreams really open up the topic. So the next three items have to do with inventories, have to do with self-investigations. And so the first one is, and to actually put this in writing, to list your personal and cultural strengths. What strengths do you bring to the research? What strengths do you bring to the topic? So, to just use a quick example, part of my cultural background had to do with learning to contain your emotions to a fault. So there's a lot of emotionally repressed people in the families I grew up in. So oftentimes the strength is also, and this is the next inventory item, what are some of the blind spots? So the strengths can be blind spots. Good emotional containment is valuable if you know what you're containing. If you don't, it functions like a repression. Another example of a personal or cultural blind spot. So it's part of the psychology of white people in this country, in the States, that we tend to think of ourselves unconsciously as the center of everything. Our values, our attitudes, our history are considered normal by us, and everybody else's are everybody else's, So there's a tendency, even when we're talking about other people or other research or whatever, there's a tendency to put ourselves right in the middle. And it always reminds me of the therapy joke about narcissistic people, where there's a narcissistic person out on a date and spends the whole day talking about himself and then says, well, enough about me. What do you think about me? Right? So this is something that we have to watch. It's part of our privilege, our sense of privilege. So it's an unconscious place for us. So one of the things that helps compensate for that is to make sure that when you do research, whether you're white or a person of color, but when you do research, to make sure that the topic is at the center of the research. The topic, not this person, not you, not your values or whatever, but the topic stays in the center. And that can help to some extent, but it's something that we always have to watch for. So the third inventory item is the question, to what extent do my family roles and intergenerational legacies in my family bias how I see the research? So family roles are something that, for a while it was kind of trendy to talk about them. You don't hear too much about them these days, but they're still there. And what this means is that family systems tend to organize themselves around certain roles that are unconsciously appointed to certain family members. So one family member might be kind of the hero who can do no wrong and is the high achiever and gets things done by willpower and assertiveness. Somebody else might have the family role of the trickster and just be the family comedian and never take anything seriously and disrupt everything and cause chaos. There might be a rebel or an outsider who pushes back against everything. There might be, Virginia Satir detected the role of what she called the family computer. So think of the Star Trek character Spock, the super logical person who won't talk about feelings, but they do have solutions. So they're strong in terms of solutions, but they're irritating when you just want some kind of support and they want to fix you, right? And there's many other roles too. The family martyr, so the person who kind of controls the rest of the family through poor me. And there's other roles too. So looking at that, and so here's an example. Let's say that you're researching some urgent ecological issue, and your family role was the hero. You're going to tend to have a heroic approach. Let's get in there, let's research this and probe to the very bottom of it, and let's fix things. Let's heroically charge in and fix things. Whereas if you're more of a family computer, it'll be much more in the head, much more like, let's analyze the various variables and blah, blah, blah. So it's helpful to just do a self-inventory and know what your role is, what your favored role is, and then be able to access other perspectives too. And that's as simple as asking a question like, well, I grew up being the family, let's say, ambassador, where I bridged fighting people, and I helped them talk to each other, and that, let's say, that was my role. So I'm going to want to placate and have everybody feel good. Why don't I try on the hero and see what that looks like? Or why don't I try on, and you'll find pretty quickly that certain roles are appropriate for certain topics and then others are not. So it helps your point of view be more flexible and aware. Intergenerational legacies have something to do with, there's a kind of balanced ledger of relational justice, and I'm drawing directly on the work of Ivan Bazormeni-Nagy. He was a family therapist originally from Hungary, immigrated to the United States during a time of political danger, came over basically to save his life, his own life. And one of the things he pointed out is that when relational reciprocity in a family is disrupted, it doesn't go away. It leaves this hole in relationship. It leaves this kind of, what's the term he uses? Like it leaves a debt or an obligation. Or, for instance, if one person exploits another person in the family in a very serious and long-standing way, that leaves something in the family. It leaves a permanent imbalance. And these marks, these imbalances on the unconscious family ledger get carried down through the generations. And so oftentimes people can find themselves acting according to loyalties or obligations that they don't even understand where they came from. And they actually have to go and do some research on their family and realize, oh, well, the reason that I'm so stingy is because I come from 3 generations of people that got hit hard by poverty. And I didn't even think of that, but now it's internal. And that's what happens when there's some kind of disruption of sociality or relationality or justice in a family. As it goes down through the generations, it gets internalized. And then you experience it as part of yourself. So doing an inventory on what are the legacies that came down through my family that I may be using my research to compensate for. If you do that, you want to at least be conscious of it. Now, another way of doing whole person research is to wake up your senses by spending some time in the natural world outside, around plants, around animals, in safe settings, wherever you can go, even just going out and looking up at the sky from your balcony if you have one. Gardening is great for this, especially if you can garden without gloves and get your hands in the soil. So all of those things wake your senses up and help you bring that quality of aliveness to your research. And those are good practices to do, especially if you're getting ready to either travel or do some kind of interviewing with people as part of your research. So waking up the senses by being in the natural world. Another practice has to do with always there's homework to do. Other people have worked on something close to your topic, no matter how unique it is. And so there are fields of work that you need to be aware of as a researcher. And that could be books, it could be films, other kinds of knowledge. It could be oral stories that are passed down. So when you collect that, and I'm thinking particularly of reading, of the amount of reading that you have to do when you do this work, to read reflectively. So to read some of what you need to and then sit with it. Not just to skim and scan it and all that. Some things you will need to skim because they're not really that relevant. You just need to pick up the essentials. But there are other things that you really need to let into your psyche and sit with. What do they mean by this? Or what does it mean that this circumstance happened right before that one? What is that telling me, And I should mention here, too, that reading is particularly important and time-consuming if you're doing a terrapsychological inquiry that doesn't involve interviewing. And in my book, Terrapsychological Inquiry, I mention forms of TI that don't require interviewing. Sometimes it's about comparing bodies of knowledge. So what does eco-psychology have to say to psychotherapy with regard to this specific area would be an example of one of those topics. So in that case, you're doing a lot of intellectual work. And so bringing deep reflection in letting it into your psyche is important for that kind of work. Another example of whole person research. So art and performance can be really important depending on what the study is. So I'm thinking of the work of Amanda Leach, who I'm going to mention again in a moment in connection with my last point. She did a master's study based on terrapsychological inquiry. She might as well have done a PhD because it was a lot of work. And so she used art in a couple of different ways. She made art to kind of condense some of the research findings, and her master's document, her thesis, has a number of these images in it. They're quite beautiful. And then art in the sense of asking the research participants to do some weaving, because weaving was a big theme in the location that she was investigating with TI. So that's one example. There are so many possibilities. I should probably do at some point a whole video on art and terrapsychological inquiry. Here's where you can really get creative and bring in a lot to a study. There are some things that you can express with art that you just can't do verbally. So, and then performance too. So, especially toward the end of a terrapsychological inquiry, being able to dance it, for instance, or creating a new system of movement to illustrate your point. Those can all be great work, especially if they involve an audience of some kind. So through all the process, it's important to also come at this with a research journal that lists where you are with the work, impressions, doubts, questions that you're asking, moods, body feelings, old feelings that the work is bringing up, old wounds that are coming up, things like that. The research journal, traditionally in qualitative research, is a kind of a paper trail, so that you can go back and check things when people want to know more about certain aspects of your research. But it should also serve too as a kind of track of your process, your whole person process as you go through the work to the end of it. And then the last thing I mentioned, so Mandy Leach has this great statement in her master's thesis where she talks about playing attention. I love that. Play should be part of this. It's not about proving things. It's not about more rigorous than now. There should be a spirit of play that permeates the whole thing, no matter how serious the topic is. And TI has dealt with some extremely serious topics. So, but there are intervals where things can lighten up, and I would take advantage of those as much as possible. In the end, if you're not having fun doing your research at some point, there's probably something wrong with it. So on that note, take care.